My fascination, after being practicing for over 40 years, is this integration of the human being between heaven and earth. And it's so sad that the most vital parts of nutrition have been completely lost. If I said to you, do you think that light controls everything? I'm not sure what your reaction would be. But where I leave my dog, which is a beautiful farm where he doesn't have to be vaccinated and he can run free because I'm away so much, they had no calves last year due to the darkness. And so I'd like to really throw the picture in terms of dis-ease much larger. We are resonance beings, and in order not to be in dis-ease, we have to resonate to all of the natural rhythms. And the natural rhythm, the charge of the earth, changes every 2 hours. We've lost all of this information. The East, fortunately, still has it alive. So we're resonance beings, and we change our charge. And so looking at healthy nutrition, which we'll do, is enabling us to dance to these rhythms. In these changes, it's really beautiful because every 2 hours, there is a focus of resonance on one of the 5 emotions and the organs which control these emotions. So they are swept past, if you like, every day. Each part of the body, each emotional body is swept past every 2 days. Then we have a 24-hour rhythm, which is so, so important. In medical school, it used to be called the sodium pump, just a matter-of-fact chemical thing, but it's far, far more than that. We have 4 main electrolytes: sodium and potassium, calcium and magnesium. And it is dependent upon the position of these electrolytes, what charge you hold, because we're electromagnetic beings trying to survive in this hideous amount of electromagnetic pollution. So during the day, sodium and calcium that are joined at the hip will move into the cell. They will move out, push out, sodium will push out potassium, calcium will move out magnesium. Then, at night time, when we're under the influence of the dominance of the moon rather than the sun and we're lying down, you know how the moon influences the waves? The moon will then attract the sodium with its partner calcium out of the cell, and the magnesium and the potassium will move back in. So you have this sort of rhythm, which needs to be complete. Then, of course, we have the lunar rhythm, the waxing, the pulling up, the absorption, and the waning, the letting go. And then in the East, we have 5 seasons, and each of those seasons has organ and emotion connected to it. So not only do you have a 24-hour visitation to the organs and the emotions, but you have a yearly visitation to these as well. And all of these rhythms are influencing the fluids and the movement of the fluids in our body. In the East, they know that the water element holds the emotion fear. And the first principle that I teach in the college is that all stress resonates on the water within us. It's water that holds the messages, the clear messages. And our physical body should be 70% water and our brain 80%. It's something in the same ratio as land to sea on planet Earth. And it's really important for us to maintain this, because this is where we hold our wisdom. So very often water is called the liquid crystal between heaven and earth. So the way I look at disease is, the first thing is stress, from whatever area, whatever is bringing it in. And a lot of it will be predispositions, which I'm paying a lot of attention to in my next book, which is published in November, because it seems to me people are not looking at where they come from. The geology of where the family came from imprints upon blood groups and all manner of things. And people never, ever suddenly develop a disease. It's simply not possible. The body does not know how to do random leaps. I find when I'm taking a detailed case history, I will often say, as I did on Saturday, well, what happened to your kidneys? Oh, gosh, Barbara, I forgot to tell you that I had kidney stones 3 times in my life. So the East knows this beautiful sequential movement. So the first thing we have is stress. And if the water in our body, the central nervous system, holds this for 2 years, it will go on to something called dehydration alert. And it will want to protect the fluid within the cell. And so it can be seen in pictures how cholesterol is enmeshed in the cell membrane to protect the fluid inside the cell. Now, this is all very well, because that's controlled the situation at that moment in time. But clearly, if we want to move on, we need to switch off that dehydration alert. And as stress increases, that can continue more and more. So what does that do? Because it affects the cell membrane, it affects this movement of sodium and calcium into the cell, pushing out the potassium and magnesium, but more particularly, it affects the return. So we tend to have more sodium and calcium left inside the cells. And, of course, Gerson spoke so eloquently about the excess of sodium in the cell. I found it interesting because, of course, he was an absolute master in working with TB before the cancer. And what you usually find when people are talking about TB, it's misplaced calcium. But equally, in looking at Gerson's work, you can talk about misplaced sodium. But it is because of this day-night exchange not taking place fully, because things have changed on the cell membrane. The cell has a triple layered membrane. The inner and outer membrane hold a charge. The center is made up of saturated fats and essential fatty acids. And that middle part to the cell membrane, it operates like computer gates, opening and closing. We call them calcium channels, a lot of them. So if we look at 24 hours being a cycle, we find that on waking in the morning, the perfect cell, the nucleus, will have a positive charge, the inner membrane will have a negative charge, and the outer membrane a positive charge. And this cell membrane potential is the most valuable thing you are carrying in your body. I think it is no mistake that it is called membrane. They know that the nucleus does not control the functioning of the cell now. It's all happening in the membrane. And I've always looked to this as the doorman between the macrocosm and your microcosm. Because to fulfill who we are, we need to have a body which will allow the maximum information from the macrocosm to come into your individual microcosm so that you can be who you are. Because I've always said to my students that I feel the biggest stress is not being who we are. And certainly when you listen to Steve, I mean, he and I worked together in Totnes, and all his amazing information of what is going on, creating all of this sort of stress, you can see how this is impinging here. So we want to have this positively charged nucleus, negative inside, positive outside. And the wider the differential, the better it is. So the more in dis-ease we are, the closer the charge of those two. Now, the very, very important thing about this is this integration of heaven and earth in our body. The positive charge on the outside of the cell can therefore attract electrons. And electrons are negatively charged subatomic particles. And so if you have a strong positive charge, you will have a huge collection of electrons coming towards each cell membrane. And it is said that the more evolved a person, the larger the electron cloud. We have the ability, along with dolphins and whales, to create the largest electron clouds. The electrons then trap within them, in this halo, if you like, this cloud, they then trap the photons of light. And this is the interesting thing that has so been left out. You have to have the photons of light there to attract the oxygen. Because without the photons, you will not attract the oxygen to the cell. And we know that if everything is in balance in the cell, that the ATP, the energy, the adenosine triphosphate, in that perfect cell will be produced 80% from oxygen and only 20% from glucose. But when we get the change to the other end of extreme dis-ease, then there is this change of function where the oxygen isn't available, and so the cell is almost anaerobic. It's functioning on 20% oxygen and 80% glucose. In that form, it goes on to energy-sparing form, where it starts to replicate itself because it becomes fetal-like. So you can see why I am so passionate about light. You know, we have our spiritual courses, which are talking about awakening the light body and the light body, but we have a physical light body, and life is totally, utterly dependent upon it. We must attract the light to the cells to then bring in the oxygen. So we start with our nutrition, where those electrolytes need to be in balance, the charge of the cells. But what is, of course, even more magical, where energy, quantum physics needs to be brought into account, that it has been found that there are not enough calcium gates to allow this movement of calcium in and out. And so now people, of course, have come to the conclusions that Steiner and great minds, and in homeopathy we also knew that transmutation takes place. And for transmutation to take place, you can find the formulae. There have to be enough photons of light and enough molecules of oxygen for these to take place. So that there is this energetic magic that is taking place at cellular level, which is so important to remember when we're working with people with much deeper illnesses. And those illnesses, by definition, there will be a darkness and this need to raise this level of light that we're bringing in. And also, the whole form of communication, you know, when there is this aspect, you know, do we become attracted to people or not? You know, and people being radiant. And the word I most like, which I think is most misused, is the word enlightened, because it doesn't belong to religion. It is this ability within us. And my understanding over the years is that the universal wisdom comes in as this vibration on the light, and it is then stored within the electron clouds outside the cell. And so if people ask me who I am, what do I do, I will always reply, I'm a facilitator to help people get in touch with their own inner wisdom, because their journey of how to get better, etc., isn't something which is within my remit, but it is really helping people to get into that situation. So how is it that I see disease and deepening disease? Well, the first thing is the stress. And we know that the stress creates dehydration, and when the dehydration is at a certain level, it creates stress. And it is my understanding that the so-called incurable diseases are when you have this catch-22 of stress, dehydration, dehydration, stress. So in this dehydrated state, the body is not able in any way to cleanse itself. You have stagnant lymph, you have blood cell clumping, but you have stagnation because dis-ease is stagnation. And then after the stagnation, if that is left there for long enough, we create inflammation. And this is why I think the thermal imaging talk was so wonderful, because I believe this is where the biggest mistake is made in the West. So we have stress, dehydration, stagnation, inflammation, and if that isn't resolved correctly, we go on to encapsulation and isolation. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about mental illness or other tissue changes. There is this situation of isolation. That person is out of touch. Their cell membrane potential is very weak. They can't attract that electron energy, which comes, the electrons come from the earth, in our food, walking barefoot, and the photons from above. And so the area which I think needs enormous examination is what the Western world does with inflammation, because it's either suppressing it or it's making you unable to feel it. Just as an example, just the other day, a lady consulted me under tremendous stress. Her husband is seriously ill. And needless to say, her blood pressure went up. This is all controlled by the water element from the kidneys. So her body was responding as you would expect it to. So she went to her GP, who gave her not one, but 3 medications for her blood pressure. The next thing was she was having acid reflux. So she was given an antacid. So after 6 months, they said she had inflammation in her esophagus. And 6 months on from there, they said she had cancer. And so there is this incredible picture you can keep following of not addressing inflammation. You know, if you had a blocked pipe in your house, you would want to go to see where the blockage was before that. What's going on before? And so my logic says, you know, if you have a very serious illness and you then have inflammation, you want to see and unblock what went on before. And it's stagnation. And it's stagnation on all levels. You know, healing is about creating freedom and movement on all levels. And we have to be able to manifest this and receive this information. So I really think we need to take a very, very long, hard look at this aspect of things. Just mentioning the fact that we are vibrational beings, just want to take the opportunity, really, because it's the thing that got me into the most trouble, and is my passion, is really to draw your attention to iodine. I was invited 2 years ago to go to Southern Ireland to start a movement for getting rid of the fluoride, the fluoride in their water. It's been fluoridated since 1962. And for those of you who are chemists know that the halogen family are very, very volatile. And on each cell, there is an iodine receptor. You know, and I ask all doctors, were you taught about the sodium iodine symporter in medical school? Never met one yet who has. But it's just as important as the sodium-potassium exchange. And so each cell has this iodine receptor. Now, if you're not taking an adequate amount of iodine and you are having fluoride in your toothpaste or your water, the fluoride is the next most active and will fill all the iodine receptors. And briefly earlier, there was talk of estrogen-dependent tumours, etc. The iodine is absolutely crucial for the ovaries in a woman to regulate the different estrogens. It's an absolutely crucial ingredient. And much more relevant recently, and somebody was asking a question about children, we need to have vitamin D3, iodine, and the DHA from the omega-3 to create a function in our body which is crucially important, the blood-brain barrier. And this mechanism is to protect the brain from any kind of toxicity. So if you stop and think about amalgam fillings and no blood-brain barrier, whatever might be put in vaccines, I had a phone call from a lady who said, Barbara, I don't know whether you can help, but may I bring my father-in-law who has motor neuron disease? And he had all the classic story. He was a retired farmer. He'd used organophosphates for dipping his sheep, etc. But this man, apparently, a few months prior to me meeting him, was driving, was fully communicating, walking, etc. But just 2 months before he came to see me, which was just prior to Christmas, he went to see his GP without his daughter-in-law. And he said, you know, you're vulnerable. You must have your flu vaccine. Gave him the flu vaccine, and I absolutely tell you, within 5 days, he could neither walk nor talk. Now, in all of these pictures that we're looking of in disease that are happening in the highest part of the central nervous system, we are talking about the blood-brain barrier. So do research it. We are not giving children, we're not giving pregnant women. Those of you who are in touch with Michel Audon's work, the amazing 80-odd-year-old Frenchman teaching women how to give birth still, he says none of the Western women have these 3 ingredients for the development of the fetus, the brain tissue. And the human brain develops much more after birth than it does before, if it's given the correct ingredients. But what I was telling my students and people is that it is thought that 12.5 milligrams is a healthy amount for many people, and that they are now going to restrict it to 0.5 milligrams. And so these are the sort of things that got me into tremendous trouble. But when you look at the beautiful work of Max Gerson, I mean, I was lucky enough to know his granddaughter well. He was using very high doses of iodine. And also, the American military, when they go on active service, are given 130 milligrams per day during active service. So if you just think of your daily life with the Wi-Fi, the mobile phone, the cordless phone, everything in your environment that is an electromagnetic pollution, the thyroid will be very, very sensitive to it. One of my sons, if he walks into a room and someone is downloading on a laptop on Wi-Fi, you can actually see his thyroid pulsating. So they are certainly after the very, very important ingredients that we should be using, I say, particularly to protect all the cells in our body. And there are some remarkable authors who've written about different forms of cancer and the importance of iodine there. I mentioned that I have a passion about predispositions. I think people used to think I was a witch, but they maybe still do. But, you know, I think I have a very logical mind. I have a mind that enjoys joining up dots. And they always say, if you can't make sense of it, go and talk to Barbara. She'll join up the dots. And this is my utter respect for how there are no random leaps. You know, the body is the most amazing, amazing thing. And so looking at case histories. And so I wasn't more than a decade into my practice when I realized for this to manifest, shall we say, anorexia, there would have to be a particular predisposition coming from previous generations. And I think the understanding of this has become so lost because we put in prison and ridiculed some of the most brilliant minds. And I'm referring to Béchamp, Gaston Nissen, and Royal Rife, as you many people here will know, are about resonance. But it's this understanding of what is it that's influencing our cells. And the ancients used to talk about the humours, meaning the fluids in the cell. And these are the minutest things. They're all the same thing, the microzyma, the bion, or the somatid. These are these influences that are present that influence the form of the cell. And they can change form, 16 different forms. And depending on these different forms, you find the cell will operate in a particular way. So you have the incredibly healthy at one end influence, but when you get to the 16th form, it is mycelial. So again, you're looking at something very, very small that is influencing things. And I have a great passion about AIDS. The whole political horrors, and of when, which is actually very interesting when they created AIDS, because I was told by a very profound astrologer that the monetary system would start to crash in January 2008. And he told me that years ago, because we have Pluto, dear old Pluto, the death and rebirth planet, decided its position would be opposing the galactic center of Capricorn. And Capricorn is about money, institutions, and rigid structure. But when AIDS was created was when Pluto was opposing the galactic center of Scorpio. And so they knew it would have to be something that would have an inference to do with sexual organs. Sorry, can't hear. I'll talk more about that after. What you find when you take endless cases of people with genuine AIDS, not those who've been faultily tested, and you know it would be worth watching The House of Numbers if you haven't seen it, which is on Stephen's paradigm shift. What you find is these people have a very, very strong list of predispositions from previous generations which are very tubercular. But just before we go more into that, I want to just say what I was going to about these predispositions. As a homeopath, I'm well acquainted with the idea of miasms, and these are energetic blueprints that influence the physical structure because it's our energetic blueprint that makes who we are. And so when we've been talking about needing to have knowledge and empowerment, that can really come in a nanosecond, that change in the energetic blueprint, but then we have to go away and build the new physical body around that new blueprint. Well, when I was researching much more about AIDS, because Hay House had tried to hold me back on writing too much about AIDS, they said, let them get to know you first, Barbara, before you jump in to that one. And I came across what to me was a very profound piece of work by a Dr. Lawrence Broxmeyer. He's a physician in New York. And he was talking about the flu pandemic that happened after the First World War. Remember the Spanish flu, when so many people died. And as a medical physician, he knew that flu does not have the virulence to create a pandemic. It can create an epidemic, but it simply does not have in itself enough virulence for the pandemic. And so he investigated what these people actually died from. And he found at least 50% had actually died from TB. And he looked to see the areas of the world which had the largest incidence per capita, and Southern Ireland, of course, came right up tops. So this man was showing so strongly, and he was talking about cancer, AIDS, many other things. So when we're talking about predispositions, you can see these things when you ask about family story, where people came from, and grandparents. So in other words, if Gerson was talking about about TB and was so successful, his way of working would remove the sodium and the calcium excess from the cells, and it was totally successful. But then it moves on to something deeper. So this man is highlighting this tubercular miasm we would talk about in homeopathy being present now in so many people. And that is the inability to keep calcium in the right place. And we were talking about it staying inside the cells. And so we know that that is hardening. And we're talking about freedom and movement. And so we know in the deeper diseases, there is a hardening going on. And this is this aspect of stress, creating dehydration, stagnation, inflammation, and isolation, where cells move more into isolation. They become, in some situations, almost anaerobic. And so just going back to talking about AIDS, you find that these people, they die from two things, either pneumonia or AIDS-related dementia. And it was interesting what Steve was saying about, because both he and I are utterly fascinated by iodine and the thyroid, because I'd mentioned that I can spot thyroid 5 years before the onset of cancer. And what you find with people with a deep tubercular predisposition, i.e. people who are actually succumbing to the immune deficiency disease, is that they are developing something called Wilson syndrome, which is an inability to convert T4 to T3. And T3 is the active form of thyroxine. They have a cold body temperature, and many other things are deficient, particularly iodine. So when we're talking about this tubercular predisposition, it can affect all parts of the body. So if somebody is then given masses of Western drugs, antibiotics, if you're looking at lifestyle with the first stories that were publicized with AIDS, you can see how the immune system is destroyed. But it's interesting that the two areas of focus are either the lungs or the mind. And what we're not taught in this country is the level of the organs, the hierarchy of the organs. So just the last thing to just express this is I like to talk about the metal element in Eastern medicine. The organ which holds the message whether we're hydrated or not is the colon. It's our reservoir. And so if I had a perfect baby and I took that baby to be vaccinated, the resonance of everything in those vaccines would be held on the water element in that baby, and that baby would register that in the colon. If I then took a baby who already had that resonance of imbalance at colon level and had them vaccinated, then it can manifest at skin level. So these are the babies developing eczema after vaccination. If I then take a baby who already has the imbalance, maybe not demonstrated, but that predisposition at skin level, they, after vaccination, will have the imbalance at lung level. And this is where we're getting very close to this tubercular miasmic picture. This is the intake of qi. This is the seat of depression. It's not the brain, it's the lungs in Eastern medicine. And then, if you take a child where within its family predispositions has an imbalance at lung level and give it vaccines, that is the child where it goes to brain. So when there are all these arguments around the effect of vaccines, so if you think of no blood-brain barrier, the imbalance and the level of dehydration already at lung level. The first little boy I treated with autism, when they took him for his vaccinations, they asked, any asthma in the family? Well, the father was adopted, so there was no information there. And I think now they most commonly don't even ask. Now, if you're frightened of measles, go and get your MMR. So this is looking at the water element becoming more and more depleted, going higher up the organs. So colon, skin, lungs, and mind. And it's a very interesting way of looking at that progression when you think of how many mental issues there are now. So it doesn't matter what we're looking at, whether we're looking at cancer or whether we're looking at extreme mental illness. There are so many things in common in terms of the cellular structure and the isolation that the people will be experiencing. So, shall I leave a bit of time for questions? I think there's somebody with a mic. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Who's got the question? Oh, Barbara, you are amazing. Wonderful. My question is about the calcium deposits. I want to ask you your opinion on arthritis.
Yes.
Just any guidance, on arthritis. Is that a calcium deposit? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it is first and foremost an inflammation to begin with. So we're looking at stress, dehydration, stagnation to that area, and then the inflammation. And the body will use calcium to buffer acidity. So that whole message again is to remain alkaline. So it's a good idea to test your pH once a week, so that you know if the diet suits you. Yes, so it's quite a superficial situation. Doesn't call for chemotherapy, which is what they're giving. Yes, so it's a strong sign of the pH being really wrong and the electrolytes getting out of balance. But remember also that this aspect of the electron cloud, where Budwig's work is so beautiful, you're looking at the oils in terms of double carbon bonds and electrons. Light and oil is interchangeable. I have patients with MS and other things who need oil here but go to India and they don't, because it's the number of double carbon bonds in the oil that attracts the light. So if you look at DHA, the part of omega-3, that's the richest source, then the EPA, then what we call the omega-3 straight, then omega-6, then omega-9. The tropical oils have no double carbon bonds. You do not need double carbon bonds in the tropics because you've got the heat and the sun. And so when I'm looking at a person and looking at their body, you're looking to see how dark and cold is the picture to match how you need to give the oil. But equally, in arthritis, you have water and wood element involved, so liver, gallbladder, kidneys, bladder. And so you would look perhaps firstly at liver stagnation, because it's all very well talking about needing oils and the electron clouds, but perhaps the most difficult thing that goes on in the West is the amount of heated fat. The liver has great difficulty dealing with any form of heated fat. So I'll usually recommend a period of time when we're getting rid of the liver stagnation, which is about structure. In Eastern medicine, the tree needs to be flexible, but also firm enough. All right.
What is the best way of topping up one's iodine level?
Thank you. Well, it's a slightly more difficult thing to answer now because of the level of radiation since Fukushima, etc. And I do quite a lot of lecturing on the Isle of Man, and they have been told never put the seaweed on your compost heaps now. It's so radioactive from Sellafield. And so what we use is Lugol's solution, which is potassium iodide and iodine, which is in fact what Max Gerson used and has been used for many, many years. So it's just a little drop of liquid, or you can buy it in tablet form if you travel around. Yes.
If I understood you correctly, you said that a cold body temperature could indicate or does indicate thyroid and therefore iodine problems. What would you regard as a...
No, I said it would indicate not converting T4 to T3.
So that is a thyroid problem?
Yes.
So
yes.
What would you regard as a cold body temperature?
Well, that's an interesting question. When I was nursing decades ago, it was 98.4, the normal. Now they say 97.4. Nobody's given any explanation, but my explanation would be exactly what we've been talking about.
So anything below 97.4?
Yeah. I mean, some people have extraordinarily low. The lowest I've ever come across are people who are here by way of IVF. Which is interesting. Oh, really low. Yeah. I mean, some of them are quite remarkable. Yeah. But we're talking about the ability to convert T4 to T3 in Wilson syndrome. And this is a precursor to the brain not functioning properly. So this would be another thing to think about with Alzheimer's and all of those things which are so much on the increase. Yeah. But there are other things you would use other than iodine. Yeah. And other techniques. Yeah.
In terms of potassium and other things, for coffee enemas, how does that throw things out? Or, like, you know, how do you ensure your system doesn't get out of whack because of it?
Well, you don't use coffee enemas unless you're on a program of what you're putting in. Yeah? And coffee enemas do several major things. With coffee, the bile is not reabsorbed. Also, if you put chlorophyll in. But the most important thing, it opens up the glutathione pathway. So coffee enemas must always be used in a program, not just randomly, where you're putting in plenty of, well, you're not just losing potassium, there are other things. So it's a question of putting plenty in. The body then becomes overloaded, particularly the liver. I mean, Gerson was the man who totally understood auto-intoxication. You know, we've had the spring equinox. People are suffering from flus and all the other things that they're suffering from right at this moment because there was a flush from the tissues into the lymph, into the blood, got to the liver. After about a week, liver said, can't cope. I need some help. And there are many different techniques for that. Yeah.
Simple question. Could you just tell us practically how you can measure your body pH? Is it
how you measure it?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there are many ways, but probably the easiest is once a week when you waken, and always do it at the same time. When you waken, swallow hard so the saliva leaves your tongue. Let the saliva reaccumulate. Spit it into a very clean spoon and put a pH stick in it. It'll give you a good comparison. And remember, the body will always maintain 7.34 in the blood, and the rest pays the price. Yeah.
When I was...
I think we have to stop.
Oh, this is important.
Yes.
Right. When I was studying Candida and giving a talk on it
Yes.
years ago, I learned that as the Candida breaks down, it can form nasties like acetaldehyde and formaldehyde.
Yes.
And these get to the receptor sites that stop the thyroxine and things getting into the
Yes.
cells. Would it be the same with iodine if the receptor sites are blocked because of Candida toxins? Would that also
No.
avoid iodine getting into the cells?
No,
Prevent
no.
iodine.
Iodine will find its way.
Will find
It is
its
so
way in.
it's so volatile. You know, the halogens are so majorly volatile.
Thank you.
Thank you.